Hello, my name is Mike McLellan. I'm a director in the SecureWorks Counter-Threat Unit. And I'm going to talk to you today about ransomware, and specifically about post-intrusion ransomware, which is where the threat actors gain access to the environment first, identify business-critical assets, servers and endpoints within the environment, and then deploy the ransomware programmatically to as many endpoints as they can to cause maximum disruption before putting extortion demands down for the victim. Becoming increasingly common. You don't have to go far now to see reports of these kind of attacks in the media. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the learnings we've had from incident response and one or two examples of the specific techniques and behaviours we see these groups implement as part of their attacks. Ransomware is very much a growing threat. It's also an opportunistic one. When we look at our data, we don't see a particular vertical that's targeted more than others. There are some who tend to see more of these kind of incidents, but I don't think that's necessarily indicative of operators specifically going after certain types of organisation. I think the threat actors will go after any organisation who looks vulnerable and who makes enough money to be worth targeting, and they'll then try and extort money from them. So an opportunistic threat as far as we're concerned, and definitely a growing one. When you look at the data from our incident response engagements, you can see a very clear increase in incidents. So looking back 2017, 10% of the engagements that our incident response teams worked were ransomware related. Fast forward to 2020, and that number's up to 38%, so nearly 40% so far this year, showing a very, very clear marked increase year on year. So definitely a growing threat, and one that every organisation needs to be paying attention to. When we talk about the evolution of the threat, there's a few kind of points in time where really ransomware became more and more concerning and more of an issue for organisations. So first emerged kind of 1989 with the AIDS ransomware, but it was in 2005 really where extortion ransomware started to become more popular. 2014 we began to see the mass campaigns delivering things like crypto lockers. So these were delivered via phishing or drive-by downloads and would infect a single host, would encrypt the system or data on that system, and then pop up an extortion note for the victim to pay. They were having impact, given the scale of the phishing and the drive-by downloads. They were having significant impact, but they were nothing really compared to what came next. So in 2015, Golden Owl were the first group who we saw that began to conduct these post-intrusion attacks. This was the group who operated the SamSamCrypt ransomware, and they were very good at gaining access to an environment using RDP, so either stolen credentials or brute forcing, moving laterally and conducting network reconnaissance using a number of different tools, and then deploying the ransomware from domain controllers using PSExec, batch scripts, that kind of thing, to push the ransomware out and really try and cause as much impact as possible. And they also were early adopters of some of the techniques around things like targeting backups to make sure that organizations were unable to recover quickly. So they were the first group really from our perspective who pioneered post-intrusion ransomware. That then became more and more common, and in 2019 we saw a further shift where in around about November we saw the emergence of name and shame as a tactic, and this is the technique where the ransomware operators steal data before they encrypt it and then threaten to leak that data online if the organization doesn't meet their extortion demands. So really adding another layer to this threat and really making it much more difficult for organizations to ignore the demands that are placed on them. So a number of different shifts have happened over time. This is all about criminals just trying to work out how best to maximize their return on investment, and doing so pretty effectively, has to be said. I talked a bit about name and shame. We've identified over 20 ransomware families that have used this tactic of stealing data and then threatening to leak it online, either via their own dedicated leak site or by collaboration with others. So I talked about the Maze Group, who are the first ones to do this around about November 2019. They then collaborated with a number of other ransomware families in sort of mid-2020 under the Maze Cartel banner, where other groups were advertising their victims through the Maze website. And that was really a kind of worrying sign of criminals collaborating, because they realised there was good money to be made. The Maze Group claim they've now retired, although I expect we'll see them again in some other form in the future. But a number of groups have emulated what they were doing around name and shame. And the key point really is it fundamentally changes the risk calculation for a victim, because no longer are they just thinking about availability of data. They've now got to worry about confidentiality as well, and can they afford the impact with regulators, with customers, of their data or their clients' data being leaked online. So criminals have realised this is an approach they can take. I think we're going to see much more of it. I think actually this is going to be the main focus now for criminals, is using stolen data to try and really put pressure on their victims. And they're doing so pretty effectively at the moment, has to be said. We've seen a couple of interventions recently to try and disrupt ransomware as a kind of class of threat. And this is some really good work that's gone on with varying degrees of success, particularly recently against the TrickBot botnet, which has been involved in the delivery of ransomware like Ryuk. It's been used as the kind of initial access that's then led to that ransomware being deployed. And in around about September of this year, reportedly, US Cyber Command went after the botnet to try and disrupt it. And then in October, Microsoft announced an initiative it had taken with a number of its industry partners to try and disrupt the botnet as much as possible through legal action, domain seizures, that kind of thing. These are all really good things that have happened. They have appeared to have had a fairly significant impact on the botnet, possibly led to the group who operate TrickBot, who we track as Gold Blackburn, actually deciding to reduce their reliance on TrickBot and use other tools like Bazaar Loader for their initial access and delivery of further payloads. So it does appear to have had some impact, not put the group out of business by any means, but certainly impacted on them, and that will have some impact on ransomware as a result, although TrickBot is only one of the many ways that ransomware gets deployed, as I'll talk about. But some good action anyway, and it's good to see this sort of thing being done, and hopefully we'll see more of it as we go forward. Other types of intervention we've seen have been of less or possibly more dubious value for the victim. So one was the Treasury announcing that it would potentially sanction organisations who paid ransoms to individuals who were themselves under sanction, which kind of makes sense from a kind of policy perspective, but it remains to be seen how that will be implemented and how aggressive the Treasury will be in going after victims who are paying because they have in their eyes no other choice. So it remains to be seen the impact of that. But another way in which governments are trying to get a grip of this threat, trying to encourage victims to do the right thing, whether that's reporting to the relevant authorities and or not paying the ransom. But another example of how some of these interventions are panning out, and something we're monitoring very closely. A lot of our customers ask whether they should pay the ransom. We don't have a formal position on that. We will not normally advise one way or the other, but we can give advice based on our experience. So we know that the decision to pay is typically based on the situation the organisation finds itself in. So can it recover its data? Can it afford to have some of that data leaked online? And it's obviously a decision taken at the very top of the organisation as to what they do. Based on our visibility, we think a large number of organisations do, probably around about half, we estimate, potentially pay the ransom. That's based anecdotally on what we see when we go into incident response and what we're told by victims, but a significant proportion of victims do decide to pay. If you do decide to pay, you should get your data back. It should also prevent more data leaking online. For the most part, these criminals operate a business model where it would be bad for business for them if their victims had any doubt about them honouring their commitment if the victim decided to pay. So normally they will honour that commitment. There will be one or two exceptions, particularly for ransomware families where they're operated as a service. So there are a number of different affiliates using the same ransomware variant. You will probably find some affiliates who are less honourable, if I can use that word, and who will take payment and then decide to still release the data or to try and get more money out of the victim or whatever it may be. But for the most part, with the more established groups, you should get your data back, and it should prevent the data being leaked online, although you'll never be able to say for sure whether they've deleted it or not. The problem, though, is that even if you pay, you still need to know how they got in. So you'll still need to conduct some kind of investigation to identify root cause, to work out how you prevent other groups being successful using the same access techniques in future. So paying is definitely not a silver bullet. And the recovery time, if you do pay, is still likely to be days or weeks, possibly even months, depending on how significant the disruption has been. So, paying is a business decision. Every organisation takes a different approach. It's not a silver bullet, though. Should definitely focus on preventing these things happening in the first place and being able to detect them if they do, and not rely on paying as a kind of way out of this particular problem. Typically, these attacks all unfold in a similar way. There are some tactical kind of nuances that I'll talk about in a bit, but at a strategic level, or a high level anyway, these attacks all follow a fairly similar methodology, which is that the actor will try and gain access to the environment, typically using one of three ways. They'll then look to pivot to central servers to try and achieve freedom of movement and ultimately find somewhere where they can stage their tools that has good visibility across the environment. So domain controllers are always a popular choice because typically from a domain controller you can access most other hosts in the environment. They'll then build a target list, working out which accounts they might be able to use and identifying where critical servers may be and work out where they want to try and deploy the ransomware to. And then they'll deploy it at time of their choosing, typically when security teams are likely to be at a lower state of readiness, so late at night, early in the morning, that kind of thing. Typically deploy the ransomware programmatically, so scripts or some other technique, to push it out to that list of targets and then start the encryption process. And then we often see these groups double check the encryption is actually happening because they want to make sure they're going to be able to get some money out of this victim, so they'll want to make sure that the process has started, and then they'll wait for the victim to get in touch and hopefully for the criminals negotiate to pay the extortion demand. I couldn't talk about ransomware and not talk about Ryuk because it's been in the news so much recently. There was public reporting came out earlier this month, early November, around an imminent threat to the healthcare sector from Ryuk. I have to say, based on our visibility, we weren't seeing that, and I don't think we've seen that manifest either. But there was reporting of it anyway, and it caused a fair amount of excitement among a number of organisations. The US Department of Homeland Security released this advisory which talked about some of the techniques typically used for Ryuk delivery, and they updated that to then talk about Conti as well. I say, while we didn't see that threat manifest, it's clearly good that this work was done. Lots of good work went into publishing indicators and that kind of stuff to try and help organisations prepare themselves. All I would say is that while we know that these ransomware families do affect healthcare organisations, they also affect a whole load of other organisations. So anyone, regardless of which vertical you're in, should pay attention to some of the stuff that came out and make sure you've taken those indicators, implemented whatever detections you can to look for these sort of TCPs. And really, these sorts of advisories are great for exposing some of the behaviours you should be looking for. So whichever vertical you may be in, even if you're not a healthcare organisation, take a look at this stuff and figure out how well you are instrumented to detect it on your network. When we talk about Ryuk, it's also worth pointing out, and this came out in the DHS advisory on the sort of subsequent evolution of it, that there has been a shift, we think, in how Ryuk is being used. So I want to touch on that briefly before we move on. So between August 2018 and March of this year, we saw dozens of Ryuk incidents across our client base, and they all followed a fairly similar playbook. So initial access was via TrickBot, lateral movement was then Cobalt Strike, Interpreter, PowerShell Empire, that kind of thing. And then deployment was via PSExec, a couple of batch scripts to push the ransomware out and then execute it. Ryuk then disappeared really between March and September of this year, and when it re-emerged, it felt a little bit different. Different initial access, so through IcedID or Bazaar Loader, otherwise known as T9, operated by the same group who operate TrickBot. Slightly different tools used for lateral movement, but still plenty of overlap there. And then deployment, some are reported through PSExec, but also through Cobalt Strike installations. But there was sufficient variety in the types of intrusion we were seeing and the techniques we were observing that led us to conclude that Ryuk, which had been operated, we think, by a single group prior to March of this year, is now potentially being operated by multiple groups. So we're still trying to track that, still trying to figure that out, but it seems like use of Ryuk may have been kind of federated out to a number of different criminal groups, and as a result we're seeing slight variations in terms of the intrusion techniques that are being used. At about the same time we saw the emergence of Conti. The techniques we're seeing associated with Conti match pretty much exactly what we're seeing with Ryuk prior to March of this year. So our assessment there is that the group who were operating Ryuk may still be operating it to some degree, but are now also operating the Conti ransomware and are using a lot of the same behaviours and playbooks to deploy the ransomware. So these are just a couple of the ransomware families that are out there. They are definitely prevalent threats for organisations, and they are high impact when they happen. My point really is that, firstly, pay attention to stuff whether you're in healthcare or not, but also be aware that there have been some changes potentially in terms of who's operating these ransomware families, and there are always humans behind this stuff, and it's important for us to try and maintain some visibility of what different operators are using, and be able to try and cluster activity based on the behaviours and not just on the ransomware family that we see at the end of it all. I talked about the three techniques for initial access. They are scan and exploit, so find internet-facing vulnerable systems and exploit them. stolen or brute force credentials, so RDP, VPN, those kind of things, to then come in using remote access solutions with stolen credentials, or commodity malware where things like TrickBot, Emotet, IcedID, which may be in the network for weeks or months before a ransomware attack, are then leveraged by a human operator to get interactive access to the environment, begin to move laterally, drop in tools like Cobalt Strike and PowerShell Empire, and ultimately deploy the ransomware. So there's there's a sort of quick end to the incident where the actual ransomware phase may only last a few days while the interactive operations are ongoing, but the commodity malware that facilitated that access may have been there for months. So being able to detect that stuff is really crucial. And there are ways to prevent or detect these access techniques being successful. So for scan and exploit, obviously patching to prevent publicly known vulnerabilities being exploited is going to be pretty effective. For credential reuse, using multi-factor authentication and also other best practice around credential management will mean that even if user credentials are stolen, they can't be easily replayed against the environment, and they certainly can't lead to a domain-wide compromise, which is sadly all too often what we see happen in these cases. And then with commodity malware, having the right controls in place to detect that, whether that's email filtering and other controls on your email gateways, endpoint detection to identify the malware being installed, whatever it may be, identify that commodity infection, be able to react to it quickly before it can be used to gain access and then ultimately launch a ransomware attack. So I want to touch on one case study, which is Dupont, the group who operate the 777 ransomware. I've talked a bit about Ryuk, and they're obviously very important. There's been a lot of recent reporting on that, which is why I haven't covered it in this talk, but I'd recommend people to read the FireEye blog on the on Ryuk and Conti that came out a week or two ago, so earlier in November. But I wanted to focus really on Dupont for a couple of reasons. One is that they are technically fairly sophisticated. They're one of the more competent groups that we have seen. The other is that they are less commonly reported on than some of the other groups. They are possibly less active, fewer victims, but very competent where they do launch attacks, but less public reporting. So I thought it'd be good to kind of highlight some of their TTPs and really talk about some of the things that we see this group using. Notably, one of the things we don't see them use is name and shame tactics. So these are not one of those 20 plus groups who are leaking victim data online, or at least aren't at the moment. I wouldn't be surprised if that changes, but right now they don't employ name and shame tactics. So that makes them kind of stand out and makes them kind of interesting. One other thing to note with this group is that they are relatively quick once they come into an environment. So they're hands-on keyboard to ransomware deployment, typically around 2 or 3 days. So you don't have long with this particular group. Worth just being aware of that and thinking about how you detect some of the things I'm going to talk about now within that time frame. In terms of their tool set, Dupont use a wide range of tools. The ransomware, as I've talked about, is Defray prior to 2019, and since around about 2019 they've used 777. They've used a number of tools for lateral movement and privilege escalation. So Cobalt Strike is one they really like to use. Vigilant is a loader, which we think is exclusive to this group. They've used that either by side loading or by pointing to file paths using Windows services to launch Vigilant, which can then load Cobalt Strike in memory, and they've then deployed 777 in memory. So a lot of the activity isn't happening on disk, makes it much harder to detect, and the stuff that is on disk is fairly well obfuscated. Pixie is another remote access tool they've used, and System BC for tunneling to compromise hosts, so being able to pivot into the environment through kind of hosts on the edge of the network and then gain access to those on the inside. And then for system and network reconnaissance, tools like SharpHound have been used to enumerate Active Directory and figure out the topology of the environment and figure out where they're going to deploy their ransomware. People like to see these things mapped to attack. I'm always slightly skeptical about the value of that, but anyway, these are the Dupont techniques mapped to attack as we've seen them. One thing you'll note is the lack of techniques in the collection and exfiltration tactics, and that's principally because we don't see them conducting data exfil. So while you could argue that some of the stuff they do might fall into some of these tactics, typically where we've seen them is in other areas of the attack matrix, and so I kind of lay that out there just for those who like to visualize this stuff in that kind of way. Digging into that a bit then, because obviously with attack, good as it is, you still need to understand how these techniques are actually being implemented. Initial access, commonly via RDP. We don't always know how the credentials are being obtained. They may be being purchased, they may be being stolen, maybe brute force, maybe through third-party providers that have been compromised. But RDP access has been one they have frequently used to gain access, and we've also seen them re-enter compromised environments post ransomware event, so after the ransomware has been deployed, to check that it's been successful and things have been encrypted. So we have seen them use that extensively. They've also used phishing for delivery. So prior to October, we were seeing them using, since October, we've seen them using TrickBot. And then since July, we saw them using Iced ID, and the screenshot there from our endpoint agent is a process tree for Iced ID leading to Cobalt Strike that was ultimately then leveraged in a 777 ransomware event. Execution depends on the access approach, I suppose. Phishing obviously requires a user to interact with it to some degree, but once they've gained that initial access, they've made extensive use of PowerShell-based frameworks, Cobalt Strike, things like that. They've also used native tools like WMI for command execution to enumerate hosts, whatever it may be. So lots of kind of scripting used by them. They're competent at using all these frameworks to good effect. Persistence, often via Windows services, whether that's to run encoded PowerShell, or it's to run, which will typically be something like Cobalt Strike, or to run the vitet loader, which can then either be sideloaded by a signed executable, or can be loaded directly by pointing to a UNC file path. We've seen them use Windows services quite a lot. One of the things that this group has kind of stood out with has been their use of timestamps in things like service names and in file paths, that kind of thing. So certainly we've seen them do that a number of times, and that's made it easier for us to work out when the compromises occurred, and also to track them across the environment. So that's something that's notable about them. But use of Windows services anyway is something they've used extensively for persistence in compromised environments to load some of those tools I talked about earlier. Privilege escalation, credential access using fairly classic techniques, I guess. Cobalt Strike, Metasploit, that kind of thing. They've also used sysinternals tools to dump processes and then pull credentials out of those dumps. So dumping LSAS is a common one. They've also dumped registry hives. And they've also used the odd local privilege escalation to gain privileged access on a host. So a range of tools used there. Most good endpoint controls will detect this stuff, but certainly worth thinking about whether you're instrumented to spot this stuff if it starts to happen in your environment. One of the things that makes the group stand out, and one of the things that makes them interesting, is the extent to which they conduct defensive evasion and anti-forensic techniques. So they'll deliberately target backup servers. They're not the only group who do that, but they will deliberately go after servers that may aid recovery and try and hinder the ability of the victim to recover their files and their network. They will often also delete useful forensic artifacts, so log entries and that kind of thing are often targeted for deletion using scripts. So they seem quite aware of forensic techniques and quite keen to make sure that it's hard for responders to figure out what's happened. I guess slow down the response effort is ultimately their game there. They've used signed executables for sideloading, which obviously will bypass some endpoint controls that are based on file reputation, because the loading executable is highly reputable. It's got a code signing signature which is valid, but it's sideloading something like vitet. They've used Windows tools to delete free disk space, so things like cipher.exe. They've also used a high degree of code obfuscation for things like vitet to make it harder to detect on disk and to analyze once incident responders have managed to obtain it. For discovery and lateral movement, tools like SharpHound, as I said earlier, for network reconnaissance, and then typically PowerShell-based frameworks, Cobalt Strike, things like that for lateral movement. Again, these are tools that might also be used by a red team or by other threat actors, but Dupont have used these extensively in the intrusions that we observed. Mentioned earlier, they're not known for collection and exfiltration. They have frequently been in proximity to highly valuable data but chosen not to steal it, which is notable. As I say, that may well change over time, but for the time being, they appear to not be using name and shame techniques, not be exfiltrating data. And that's obviously important to understand. This is where threat intelligence can help drive good decisions around incident response. When you understand what the groups have been known to do in the past, it gives you insight into what they may be doing in your environment. So that's something to note for this particular group. Not now the norm. Most groups now are using name and shame techniques. And then command and control and impact, as I said earlier, Cobalt Strike, Pixie, that kind of thing. system BC for tunneling, and then typically deploying 777 via things like Cobalt Strike in memory, so very few disk artifacts to great effect, and they've been extremely effective, this group, in the intrusions that we've seen them in. So that's a quick run through of Gold Dupont to give you a bit more detail on some of the techniques they've used. As I said earlier, different groups use different tools and different tactical approaches, but at a higher level, their general approach will be the same, which is gain access, pivot to critical servers, identify where you want to deploy the ransomware, deploy it, and then check you've been effective before you then enter into extortion or ransom negotiations with the victim. So just to finish off then, some key takeaways and some key kind of messages to leave you with. These are opportunistic threats. Your goal should be to persuade them to go elsewhere by raising the cost of gaining access to your environment. And as I said earlier, there's a number of ways you can do that. You can do that through good hygiene, so by patching, by implementing multi-factor authentication, by architecting the network in such a way that it's not flat, it's very hard to move laterally across different segments. You can make it hard for these operators, once they've gained access, to be able to move around. So prevention should be a focus here. You can prevent these things. Lots of organizations manage to do it. And it's something that you should really be considering as in terms of your control framework. Have you got those preventative controls in place? If you then assume they're not going to be wholly successful, can you detect and contain an intrusion before it leads to a ransomware event? Instrumentation really is crucial here. If you can't see your network, it's very hard to defend it. We also talk a lot about tripwires, defense in depth, layered controls, whatever it may be, but making sure that you can detect these attacks in multiple phases rather than just relying on detecting the initial access or detecting the ransomware deployment will give you a much better chance of responding. You've typically got a few days between initial hands-on keyboard access and the ransomware deployment in which to react. Plenty of organizations are successfully avoiding these catastrophic ransomware events because they are prepared for them. So think about how well you're prepared, think about your security testing, whether you can run red team assessments that emulate ransomware attacks, whatever it may be, to help you get better prepared for them. And also think about how you can use good threat intelligence to help drive your response actions, understand what adversaries you're up against, and once you've identified what's happening, understand the best course of action to prevent their known behaviors and their known tools and techniques being effective within your environment. So good threat intelligence can really help there. So that's all I was going to talk about. That's a fairly rapid run through of the sort of ransomware landscape, focusing particularly on Gold Dupont as a bit of a case study. Hopefully that's been useful. Obviously, if you've got any questions, then feel free to reach out. Happy to discuss any of that further. Thank you very much for your time.